Greetings, this is PJ Leash, manager of the UW-Madison Insect Diagnostic Lab, and I'm going to be giving you a recap of what I've seen come through the lab. Because this is my first year in the diagnostic lab, I wanted to give you a brief history of the lab. It was started back in the late 70s and was managed by Phil Pelletieri for 36 years before he retired at the end of February in 2014. I began in the lab in March on an interim basis and was given the permanent position in July this past summer. Each year the lab handles between 1,500 and 2,000 cases, and at the current moment in late September I'm at just over 1,800 cases and will probably hit 2,000 cases by the end of the year. One of the first things I did when I joined the lab was to redo the lab website. If you'd like to find any more information out about the lab, feel free to visit the link mentioned on this particular slide. In addition to redoing the lab website, I also launched a blog for the Diagnostic Lab titled What's Crawling in the Lab. It's a way for me to share highlights of interesting cases that I see coming through the Diagnostic Lab. So for an example post here, for the goldsmith beetle, you'll notice that there's a short paragraph followed by a picture of a neat insect that I've seen come into the lab. So if you'd like to kind of follow along and see what I have coming, I tend to post on the blog about every week or two with interesting cases. In addition, in the near future, I'll be launching both Facebook and Twitter accounts for the Diagnostic Lab. So if you're on either of those social media sources, feel free to follow along and learn about interesting cases. Before I talk about the insect highlights for 2014, let's review how the year was weather-wise. First and foremost, we all remember the brutal winter we had last year. It certainly was cold, and that may have affected certain insects. In addition, we had a pretty cool and wet spring, and all that moisture may have affected insects such as mosquitoes, but for some other insects I'm going to talk about, their numbers may have been down due to diseases such as fungal or bacterial diseases that sometimes crop up when we have wet weather. In addition, we had regular rainfall throughout the year, and so we had a pretty wet summer, which again would have played a role with critters such as mosquitoes. Overall, we had pretty moderate temperatures in 2014 though. We didn't have many days up in the 90s or up around 100, and so that can affect insects. When we have really hot temperatures, it can lead to faster development and we can get higher populations in some cases. But this year in 2014, we had relatively moderate temperatures. So here are some of the overall major insect trends in 2014. Some of our major pests certainly were down this year. Things like gypsy moth and Japanese beetle, which are some of our usual pests, seem to have an off year, and their numbers were down, much to the relief of many landscapers and gardeners. A relatively new invasive insect, the brown marmorated stink bug, also was pretty quiet this year, and I only had a few reports from the very southern portion of the state, mainly Rock County and the Janesville area. On the other hand, some insects and some pests had a relatively good year. Things like mosquitoes certainly had some high populations. Emerald ash borer had quite a strong year, and we had new county level detections in several cases throughout the state. And so at the current moment, we're up to roughly 36 counties quarantined in the state, which is half of the state. And so it really popped up in a lot of places this summer. Some other pests, such as spotted-winged Drosophila, had a good year. We had many reports of that particular insect. And although it's not a pest, a critter like a mayfly certainly got in the news, and we had a very, very large mayfly emergence along the Mississippi River back in late July. The first insect pests that really popped up this year were mosquitoes. Around the time of Memorial Day weekend, I had been up in northern Wisconsin, and as we got to about 3 or 4 in the afternoon, on the Sunday of that weekend, it was as if someone flipped a switch and suddenly all these mosquitoes came out. That large emergence was likely due to a late snowmelt with our cool spring, but also a combination of the rain that we had. Because we did have a very wet spring, we had a lot of cases throughout the state of high mosquito numbers, causing a nuisance to folks, and we had very high mosquito numbers through June and July in the state. Now, one interesting thing to point out is despite these high levels of mosquito, West Nile cases, disease cases, were down in the state, which is somewhat counterintuitive. The thing is, it turns out that the mosquitoes that take advantage of that rainfall and flooding out in the woods, species such as Aedes vexans or floodwater mosquito, they are nuisance mosquitoes. They are not able to spread a disease like West Nile. And so, out of all the 50 plus mosquito species in the state, only a few can spread diseases like West Nile, and those particular species, such as Culex pipiens, don't respond as readily to rainfall events, and instead they breed in more permanent bodies of water, such as a hollow container, an empty bucket that filled up with rain, or an old tire. So, despite having a lot of nuisance mosquitoes, the good news, if you try to be an optimist, is that the cases of disease were down this year. One of our usual insect pests that was down this year was the gypsy moth, and we certainly did have a quiet year. I had very few reports of damage to ornamental oaks and yards, that kind of thing. The few reports that I did have seemed to come from Rock and Walworth counties. Overall, though, their low numbers may be part of a multi-year trend. Gypsy moth have been, in general, fairly low the last couple of years. Now, part of it may be our cool, damp conditions we had at the beginning of 2014. And we also had in 2013 a very similar situation. And whenever we have these cool, damp conditions, it can favor the development of diseases, such as fungal diseases that can pop up and kill off insects such as gypsy moth. And so I think the cool, wet weather that we have certainly helped to keep their numbers in check. One of our other spring caterpillar pests is the eastern tent caterpillar. This is the one that often makes the silken tents in cherries and other trees out in the woods in spring, right around the time of leaf and bud expansion. However, their numbers were down this year, and I think it may be another case where those damp, cool conditions helped some diseases pop up and keep their numbers in check. What's interesting, though, is our fall caterpillars that make tents. The species such as the fall webworm seems to be having a decent year. I've gotten a lot of reports of tents out in trees this time of the year and in late summer, and so it's interesting that even though we've had some continual rainfall throughout the summer, the fall webworm species seems to be doing okay this year. To go along with this theme of damp, cool weather and diseases popping up and killing off insects, I wanted to share some of the pictures with you that I saw coming into the diagnostic lab this year. So on the left-hand portion of the slide, we see a picture of a moth that was affected by a cordyceps fungus. It climbed up onto a tree where it died, and we can see these unusual structures, spike-like structures, coming out of the insect, and that is portions of the fungus that have developed and will be releasing spores into the environment. Same kind of thing with the spider. In the middle picture, we see it's very fuzzy and covered with spores. And then on the picture on the right-hand portion of the slide, we see a fly that has climbed up a hops vine and is hanging there. Its abdomen is a little bit fluffy with fungal spores, and the fly died in that location. Turns out some of these fungi almost brainwash or turn insects into zombies, and it causes them to climb up onto vertical surfaces where they can get good exposure to wind. The insects die, and then the wind can carry fungal spores out into the environment to repeat the infection process. And I actually had several cases of flies very similar to this coming in back in May and June because of the wet weather that we had had. Japanese beetle are another one of the major insect pests that were notably down in 2014. We had a somewhat late emergence, and while I did have reports of beetles coming out late June, early July, around their usual time, it seemed like their peak numbers were pushed back a little bit later in the summer. Overall, though, the numbers of Japanese beetles seem to be down statewide, and I had relatively few reports of significant damage in this state. The one spot that seemed to have the most damage was the Plover area near Stevens Point, but other than that it was pretty hit or miss, and they didn't seem to be as big of a problem as they have been in later years. The reason for this, I think, may have to do with the weather that we had last winter. Now, Japanese beetles spend the winter as white grubs down in the soil, and they can be several inches down. And when folks originally asked me back in March and April what I predicted for the year, I figured their numbers wouldn't have been affected a whole lot because we had about a foot or so of solid insulating snow cover. those grubs were below ground. They have some other ways to help spend the winter. However, we also did get reports of very deep frost, 6 feet down, and water pipes bursting, that kind of thing. And so I think this is a case where, with Japanese beetle, that hard frost and prolonged cold temperatures managed to get down deep enough, and I think it killed off a good number of Japanese beetles so that their numbers were down at least in 2014. Now, unfortunately, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be down in 2015 because the females that were out this year can lay an awful lot of eggs, and so I'm going to be curious to see how the Japanese beetle populations rebound going into 2015. Another insect pest that was down this year is the invasive brown marmorated stink bug, which is an exotic pest from Asia. It got into the eastern portion of the US back in the mid 1990s and has spread westward since then. Now, this is a pretty nasty pest because it can attack so many different types of plants, agricultural crops such as corn, vegetables like tomatoes and peppers, fruits such as apples, grapes, and others, and it can even attack ornamental plants. And it can also be a structural pest similar to box elder bugs or multicolored Asian lady beetles, in that it tries to sneak into homes in the winter, and it'll get into attics and crawl spaces. Unlike some of the eastern states, such as Pennsylvania and Maryland, where economic losses have been caused by this insect, it's been pretty quiet in Wisconsin. We picked it up back in 2010 for the first time, and we do have adults confirmed from about 7 counties in the southern and southeastern portion of the state. However, the good news is that the past few years, 2012, 2013, and 2014, it's been very quiet, and we've only picked up a couple of these insects each year. In 2014 alone, the only cases we had in the state came out of Rock County and the Janesville area. Similar to the brown marmorated stink bug, the emerald ash borer is another exotic and invasive species from eastern Asia. It was first detected in the state in the Newburgh area in 2008 and has been marching across the state since then. And unfortunately, 2014 happened to be a pretty good year for the emerald ash borer. This individual insect kills trees due to the feeding activity of the larvae, these whitish worms, as shown in the lower right hand picture. They feed beneath the bark of the tree, destroying the vascular tissues that transport water and nutrients, essentially girdling the tree from the inside. Now, when populations of the insect are low, it can take 5 or more years for a tree to succumb to the damage and ultimately die. When populations are higher, trees may be killed in just a few years. During one of those brutal cold snaps in early 2014, people started wondering about how the cold temperatures might potentially affect emerald ash borer. Turns out that emerald ash borer larvae start dying around minus 20 Fahrenheit, and we did reach those temperatures for brief periods of time. Now, unfortunately, when you get to those temperatures, it only kills off approximately 50 to 60% of the emerald ash borer larvae. Now, some USDA scientists ran some models to determine the ultimate outcome under different scenarios. And if we look at the red line in this graph, that predicts what happens to ash trees in an area if there is no emerald ash borer mortality. We see that the trees die very quickly. The green line shows a model similar to the weather we had this past winter, minus 20 or so, where 50 to 60% of the larvae die. Now, the interesting point here is that the overall tree death is slowed down, but ultimately those females that survive can lay enough eggs that over time those insects can still overpower and kill off ash trees. Now, what's interesting though is that as we approach minus 30 degree Fahrenheit, at those brutally cold temperatures, approximately 90% of the larvae die. And so in spots of the country such as northern Minnesota where they regularly see these cold temperatures, emerald ash borer may have a hard time establishing itself and killing large areas of forest land. Over the next couple of slides, I'm going to show you a series of maps to help illustrate the detection and spread of emerald ash borer in the state. So starting with this map, which shows the state in 2008, we had our first detection of emerald ash borer near the town of Newburgh, north of Milwaukee along the Washington and Ozaukee County line. We can see that in 2009 we had some localized spread in that Newburgh area in Washington and Ozaukee counties, but we also had detections in Milwaukee County in the Oak Creek area, a find down in Kenosha, detection in Brown County, and then multiple finds along the Mississippi in Vernon and Crawford counties. 2010 was a relatively quiet year. No new major county finds, but we did have some additional finds just outside of known infested areas. We saw the same kind of pattern in 2011. Again, not a whole lot of new county finds. It seemed more of spread from around the area that was already infested. 2012 certainly was an interesting year. If you think back, was the year of the severe drought, and in addition to that, it also seemed to be somewhat of a tipping point when it comes to emerald ash borer, because this was a year where we started getting several new county finds in southeastern Wisconsin, and that pattern seemed to accelerate in 2013 and 2014. We can see in this map of 2013 that we had several new county level finds. Dane County, for example, Sauk County up at Mirror Lake State Park, and many other new detections in southeastern Wisconsin. Part of this may be due to the fact that the 2012 drought had stressed a lot of trees and would have made symptoms of EAB show up more easily. This particular map shows the same kind of information that was in the previous slide, except that this is a quarantine map, and so counties that are labeled in red either have a confirmed emerald ash borer infestation or are so close to an infested site or infested county that they've been added to the quarantine by DATCAP. So this is interesting to point out because this was the very beginning of 2014, and on the next slide I'm going to show you our current status in the state. As of mid-September 2014, this is our current status, and this is an updated quarantine map. Again, if it's a red county, it either has a confirmed EAB infestation or is in very close proximity to an infested site or an infested county. And at the moment, we're currently at 36 counties that are quarantined. So if we have 72 counties in the state, it means that we're halfway there at this point. We had an awful lot of new county level detections, and some of them, such as down in the southwestern part of the state, counties may not have a confirmed infestation, but they're essentially surrounded by infested counties, and so they have been added to the DATCAP quarantine. So 2014 was a year of a lot of new county level detections and a lot of counties being added to the quarantine. Another exotic insect pest that had a strong year in the state was the spotted winged Drosophila. Like brown marmorated stink bug and emerald ash borer, this is another invasive species from Asia. However, it happens to be a major pest of fruits, and while it can attack many different types of fruits, some of its favorites are late season raspberries and blackberries, but a wide range of fruits can be attacked. Now, what's interesting about the behavior of this fruit fly is that unlike some of our other common species of fruit flies, spotted winged Drosophila can attack ripe or intact fruit. The other species of fruit flies can only go after damaged or fermenting fruit. And the reason that spotted wing can do this is if we look at the lower right hand picture, we see the egg-laying device of the female. It looks very much like a hacksaw, and she can physically cut a slit into fruit to lay eggs, and those larvae will develop inside of the fruit and essentially liquefy it in a fairly short period of time. When it comes to the history of spotted winged Drosophila in the state, we first detected it back in the fall of 2010, and we've had fairly similar patterns each year since then. In 2014 alone, as we see in the map, and this is current as of late September, we have confirmed spotted wing cases from roughly 20 or so counties, and we have a handful of other counties that have suspected cases. And this will likely go up during the course of the fall as we can find spotted wing outside even into early November in some cases. Now, coming through the diagnostic lab this year, I did have several cases of severely damaged fruit, raspberries and blackberries in particular, although I have a few cases such as one in elderberry where I strongly suspect that spotted winged Drosophila was involved as well. And so unfortunately for the fruit crop growers, spotted wing has become a major pest that they have to deal with in the course of only a few years. Switching up gears a little bit, I'm going to talk about not so much a pest, but certainly an interesting insect phenomenon nonetheless. I'm referring to the Hexagenia mayfly hatch, which we saw in late July along the Mississippi River in the La Crosse area. Now, these mayflies spend most of their lives underneath the water, living in the sediment at the bottom of the river. But for short periods of time, they emerge as adults. Over the span of a few days, they emerge, mate, and die. And so we can get tremendous numbers, millions of insects coming out at the same time. And I had a number of calls and emails and pictures coming in of these congregations of mayflies, and we can see here from a gas station pump that the pump itself is completely covered with these mayflies. Here's some other images of an ATM and a full picture from a gas station. We can see that those mayflies have come out in force, and they are strongly attracted to lights at night, and so they can congregate in very large numbers. Now, so many mayflies came out at the same time that it actually showed up on radar from the National Weather Service. So it's interesting to think that little tiny critters such as insects can show up as a large cloud on radar. Now, so many insects came out that it actually made road conditions a little slick, visibility was down, and there was actually a car crash around that time that was likely attributed to the mayflies. Another aquatic insect that I had many cases of this year were the Dobson flies, and these can be some of our largest insects in the state, about 3 inches long or so. Now, the picture we see on the left is an adult male. The males have greatly enlarged mandibles that almost look like tusks on an elephant or a walrus. And with those tusks, in some cases, they can be close to 4 inches long. And so they are very, very large insects. As young or larvae, they live in the water. And we can see a larva here on the right-hand side of the screen. These larvae are commonly known as hellgrammites. Sometimes they're used as fishing bait. They are found in swift-moving water, streams and rivers. And when they are ready to turn into adults, the larvae will crawl up on shores and make a small cell, dig a hole in the earth, and pupate and emerge later on as adults. To continue on our theme of aquatic animals, there was a news report in early August about fishing spiders, and as a result, I received a flurry of calls, emails, and pictures regarding these large spiders. They do happen to be some of our largest spiders in the state, and they are associated with water. They get their name of fishing spiders because they can actually reach in and capture small minnows and feed on them. While they can be fairly common, they're actually quite harmless and are going to do their best to shy away from people. Around the time that I was getting all the cases of fishing spiders, it happened to be late summer, which is also the time that many of our orb weaver spiders happen to be quite prominent in the landscape, particularly in the garden. And despite their large and intimidating appearance, these are very much considered beneficial creatures. These are spiders that have very prominent webs, and they do their part out in the garden to help feed on a wide range of prey insects. My most interesting spider case for the year came in from a department store down in Kenosha County. Some employees had been opening a box from Indonesia with items in it, and as they were unpacking the items, they discovered a very large dead spider, and they sent it in for identification to make sure it wasn't a potentially dangerous species. Luckily, this particular specimen has a distinct white line just beneath the eyes, which helps identify it as Heteropoda venatoria, one of the huntsman spiders. These can be fairly common worldwide in tropical and subtropical areas, and despite the large and intimidating appearance, they're relatively harmless. That's it for my spider stories for the year, and we're going to switch up gears a little bit and talk about moths. And my first case is an invasion of the moths. Not Mothra from the old Godzilla movies, but a different type of moth, called the copper underwing. Copper underwing moths are fairly drab, grayish, brownish insects, about an inch long. However, they get their name because if you were to spread their wings and look at their hind wings, they have a distinct coppery bronze color that we can see in this picture in the lower left-hand corner of the page. Now, as young as caterpillars, they're called the hump green fruitworm, and these insects can feed on a variety of fruit trees, but they actually have a very, very wide host plant range. The copper underwing can be a fairly common species. However, the conditions must have been just perfect for this particular species this year because I had cases of very, very large numbers. These moths, which are out in late summer, also have a nuisance factor because they tend to congregate on buildings and they can sneak through very tiny cracks and get into homes and offices. Here's some pictures out of Jackson County to help illustrate the nuisance factor that the copper underwing can cause. In addition to sneaking behind siding, they can get through very small gaps and crawl into homes, and when they congregate by the hundreds or thousands, they can leave brownish excrement marks on the side of houses. While this can be washed off fairly easily with soapy water, it sure is alarming when you have 1,000 or more moths congregating on the side of your house. In addition to the copper underwing, there's a wide range of other underwing moth species. While these other species aren't a nuisance like the copper underwing, they can be fairly strongly attracted to lights, and I did have many reports of these moths in late July and early August. I was personally able to see some interesting moth cases in late July during a BioBlitz event celebrating National Moth Week. During that event, we had several of these yellow and brownish moths show up at our light traps. They happen to be imperial moths, which are some of our largest moths in the state. They can have wingspans of about 4 to 5 inches. They aren't terribly common, so it really was neat to see about half a dozen or so of these insects show up in a short time span. Another interesting moth case I saw this year is a species called the black witch. This is typically a species found more in the southern portion of the U.S., although every once in a while it gets carried up here in wind currents. This particular specimen showed up in the lab in mid-September, and I suspect that a cold front a few days earlier had ended up carrying it up here via wind. To change things up a little bit, I'm now going to talk about a couple of new species that were detected in the state during the summer of 2014. The first species is called the lily leaf beetle. It's a chrysomelid leaf beetle, and these tiny reddish beetles are about 1/4 of an inch long. They're originally from Europe. The species was detected in Montreal in Canada back in the 40s, and it was detected in New England in the US in the 1990s. However, back in July of 2014, we had a detection in Wausau. It's possible that it came through some infested nursery stock. This particular pest happens to feed on true lilies and a few other plants. It doesn't feed on daylilies, but has the potential to cause some major harm to lily plants in an ornamental setting. Here's a map as of mid-September showing the known locations of lily leaf beetle in the state. So far, all the known cases are isolated to Marathon County and centered around the Wausau area. So we have some sites in Wausau, Rothschild, Cronenwetter, and Mosinee area that have confirmed cases of lily leaf beetle. The second invasive species to pop up in this state in 2014 was the viburnum leaf beetle. This is another chrysomelid leaf beetle and is similar in size and appearance to the lily leaf beetle, except instead of being red, it's more of a yellowish green color. Like lily leaf beetle, this one is originally from Europe and was detected in Canada in the 1940s and New England in the 1990s. However, instead of attacking lily plants, this one specializes in attacking viburnum plants. Both the adults and the larvae of viburnum leaf beetle can feed on viburnum bushes. When they feed, they tend to nibble around the veins, causing damage that we refer to as skeletonization, because it leaves a framework of the leaf behind. In the case that we saw this year, over in the Milwaukee area, an entire viburnum bush had essentially had its leaves stripped by this insect. The case of viburnum leaf beetle in 2014 was actually our second case in Wisconsin. Our first case was back in 2009 in Dane County. In that particular incident, it happened to be newly planted nursery stock, and that's the likely cause of the infestation. The plants were eliminated and we saw no further activity. The find in 2014 occurred in late August over in Milwaukee County. What's interesting though is that the insect showed up and caused damage on a well-established viburnum bush, and so we're not sure at this point the origin of those particular insects or the overall extent of damage and infestation in a nearby area. So this is going to be an interesting case to follow over the next couple of years. In my last couple of slides, I'm going to share some interesting cases regarding indoor insect pests that I saw during 2014. When it came to indoor pests, I saw many of the usual suspects such as box elder bugs, multicolored Asian lady beetles, and ants. August and September certainly were full of cases of yellow jackets, and I also saw quite a few cases of the masked hunter bug, which is pictured here to the right. It gets its name because the young or nymphs stages of this insect camouflage himself with bits of lint and other debris, and so they often have this very fuzzy appearance and can really catch some people off guard because it's such an unusual looking critter. An interesting indoor insect pest that I've seen pop up frequently in August and late September is the foreign grain beetle. This is an unusual pest in that it almost exclusively shows up in brand new houses. It turns out that during construction there's a little bit of residual moisture on those 2x4s, and when the drywall and siding is put up, that moisture can stay trapped in the wall voids. These particular beetles are attracted to that moisture, and so it can be alarming when you move into a brand new house and have hundreds of these beetles show up. Luckily, as we get into heating season and the furnace kicks on, that will help dry out those wall voids of any moisture, and both the moisture and these beetles tend to disappear fairly quickly. When it comes to some of our indoor pests that like to hang out in the pantry, it can sometimes take some detective work to find the ultimate source of the insects and eliminate the problem. One of the insects that I commonly see pop up in kitchen areas is the sawtooth grain beetle, and these can infest a wide variety of stored food products such as flour, rice, and oatmeal. However, I did have a rather interesting case involving the sawtooth grain beetle earlier this summer. A gentleman had contacted me because he had these insects showing up in his clothing closet, which is a very unusual spot to find them. However, after we did some detective work, it turned out the gentleman had been to a party where a lot of home brewers were present, and they had been exchanging some materials to make beer at home. It turns out that this particular gentleman had forgotten a bag of barley and hops in one of his suit coat pockets, and that ended up being the ultimate source of the infestation. So once he eliminated that and threw it out, the beetles disappeared fairly quickly. And with that, I conclude my 2014 summary of cases from the UW-Madison Insect Diagnostic Lab. If you'd like to visit any of the websites mentioned earlier in this presentation, or you'd like to email me any questions or images of insects, the information to do so can be found here.